Conference on Karl Marx, Life, Ideas, Influence, a critical examination on the bicentenary. This conference has been organized by the Asian Development Research Institute, ADRI, as a tribute to Dr. Piyushendu Gupta and Professor Radhakrishna Chaudhary. Following the inaugural session yesterday with a keynote address by Lord Meghnad Desai, we had 6 memorial lectures and 4 research papers being presented on various aspects of Marx, ideas as well as praxis. Some of the titles covered were The Future of Globalization, Marx Misinterpreted, The Capitalist Development in South Korea, Normative Elements of Marxism, Which Kind of Elite, if one, is necessary for the masters of the universe, Ancient Indian Dialects, and Marx. We now begin the 7th lecture in the series of memorial lectures. This lecture is in memory of Joan Robinson, a British economist well known for her wide-ranging contributions to economic theory. She was a central figure in what became known as post-Keynesian economics. In 1942, Robinson's essay on Marxian economics famously concentrated on Karl Marx as an economist, helping to revive the debate on this aspect of his legacy. The lecture is titled Marxism Economics, Notes from a Neoclassical Viewpoint, and will be delivered by Professor Anjan Mukherji. This lecture will be chaired by Professor Joan Toporowski. May I request the speaker and the chair to please come on stage. Jan Toporowski is a professor of economics and finance at SOAS and holds visiting positions at the University of Bergamo, Italy, and the International University College, Turin, Italy. He was published extensively in monetary and financial economics and the history of economic thought. He is currently working on a study on the monetary theory of Kalasky. Professor, may I please request you to take over the proceedings?
Okay, thank you very much. As I was introduced, I come from SOAS, University of London. It's my great pleasure to introduce this session. At SOAS, as many of you will know, the general approach is a radical and a critical approach, in particular to neoclassical economics, to which I like to confound my colleagues by pointing out to them that Oscar Lange was a neoclassical economist as well as a Marxist. So it's not, the situation is a little bit more complex. I think a complexity which I fear Joan Robinson didn't appreciate. Her remarks on Oscar Lange were not very favorable. But it's my great pleasure today to introduce Professor Anjan Mukherji. Professor Mukherji taught at Jawaharlal Nehru University in New Delhi until 2010, when he retired as the RBI professor, Reserve Bank of India professor of economic theory. He has also taught at the London School of Economics, Cornell University and the universities of Tsukuba and Osaka in Japan. Subsequent to retirement, he was awarded the Jawaharlal Nehru National Fellowship of the ICSSR during 2011-2013. He's currently the country director of the India-Bihar program of the International Growth Centre, London. He's been appointed Professor Emeritus at JNU. His research includes studies on micro-foundations of macroeconomics, nonlinear dynamics, and complex growth processes, development and governance, and the stability of general equilibrium. For all these reasons, I look forward with great interest to Professor Mukherji's remarks on Marxist economics, notes from a neoclassical viewpoint. Professor Mukherji.
I just want to correct something that was mentioned. I'm no longer the country director of the IGC India Bihar program. I don't know how Neeraj allowed that to go through. That stopped some months ago. It's a great privilege to be invited to deliver this lecture at this conference to celebrate the 200 years of Karl Marx. Now, you just heard my background. You must be wondering what I am doing here, talking about Marxian economics, because my introduction to Marxian economics has been through the writings of other scholars, so third hand. So why am I here? You could have asked the organizers, but instead of passing the buck, let me give you a slightly different answer. It depends how you look at it, but it has to deal with Joan Robinson. And the lecture is, after all, named after Joan. In the year 73, Professor Robinson was then in Delhi, visiting the Center for Economic Studies and Planning, where I used to teach. Now, 1973 is a bit before this time, so I was much younger. My senior colleague, Professor Bharadwaj, introduced me to the venerable scholar with the words, he is our resident Walrasian and has just completed a paper on the effects of changes in the numeraire. And I winced because I realized I was going to get into trouble because of that introduction. And those of you who have had the privilege of seeing Joan Robinson would know that she can be quite terrifying, especially to young scholars. Walrasian said that. So she just said, why should it matter whether you paid in apples or oranges? She was not prepared to listen to the explanation that I had shown that it did matter, and she immediately said, give me a demonstration. So then I was getting into it deeper and deeper, something that I wanted to avoid. So then I had to tell her what the example was. So I said, well, I was doing this example of instability which involved a given good. Now, to people who are non-economists, I should probably explain that a given good is one of those goods for whose the price and quantity demanded move in the opposite direction. So the price goes up, quantity demanded also goes up, and Robert Griffin found out such a good, so it's named after him. So my idea was that if you have a good like that, then use it as the unit of account or as the numeraire, and things work out. As soon as I said it, she was absolutely, very angry. How can you do that, she said. Choose a given good as a numeraire. What? She would have probably said rubbish or nonsense or something like that. But there was a knock on the door. And who walked in was Amartya Sen. He happened to be visiting JNU at the same time. So there was an effusive welcome. Amartya Sen had been Joan Robinson's student. And she complained that, look at this young man, he thinks that you can choose a given good as a numeraire. And Amartya Sen, without batting an eyelid, said, why not? Immediately things calmed down and we moved into a general discussion of what I was saying. So if you were to ask why I'm here, so the answer is why not? So to those who wonder, my answer would be why not? Because after all, one needs to consider the fact that Marx, even 200 years after his birth, continues to attract some of the best young minds. And at the same time, currently, there hardly remains any economy whose policies could be called Marxian. The collapse of the Soviet Union, the disappearance of the Berlin Wall, major changes in China, and as this conference proceeds, happenings in North Korea signify that the markets have risen to a premium position, and certainly one may expect that someone with a background such as mine to be able to provide some understanding why this situation has persisted. So these two questions, the appeal on the one hand of bright young minds to Marxian ideas and the rejection of these same ideas by the policymakers and the states. So this is what I shall try to address. Now, one of the reasons why bright young minds get attracted is if you look around, you see evidence of large amounts of inequalities, injustices, and so on. And you like to think that maybe you can find a solution to them. Now, the study of inequality has also recently received attention from the French economist Piketty, who named his book Capital in the 21st Century. In fact, the magazine Economist described Professor Piketty as the modern Marx, and then added, strangely, within brackets, Karl, that is. What did they think? That someone would mistake him as a reincarnation of Groucho? I mean, just absurd. Anyway, that's the way it is. Now, but Karl Marx was not only concerned with inequalities, but also with exploitation. We shall return to this later. Writing more recently, that is, this year itself, Piketty, in a 2018 working paper titled Brahmin Left versus Merchant Right, Rising Inequality and the Changing Structure of Political Conflict, describes why democratically elected governments are unable to check the rising inequalities. It seems thus that inequalities are here to stay, and so therefore, if that is the source of attraction, it will remain. What I want to pose before you are some developments in what may be loosely called neoclassical economics, and whether there is a somewhat better explanation or explanation which follows from what Marx used to say. So let me try to summarize what I consider to be the main developments in neoclassical economics in recent times. Now, neoclassical is to be interpreted as a movement away from classical traditions. Beginning with the Great Depression of the 30s, it was realized that capitalism had run into serious problems and new ideas were needed to bolster up classical theories. The following three realizations, in my opinion, are noteworthy. First, that markets may not always clear, and the massive unemployment in various times seems to indicate this clearly. Second, markets may suddenly crash or cease to exist. We have seen these two at regular intervals. And C, participants in markets may refuse to be passive price takers. They often behave strategically. We see this regularly with scams of various kinds surfacing all across the world from time to time, when strategies which are either illegal or not permitted often do get carried out in the absence of proper regulation. So the markets and institutions often do not carry out tasks that we expect them to do. Now, these realizations have led to several developments, and let me spend some time on that. Now, the responses have come at different points in time. I'll try to be as historically correct, but it's sometimes difficult. First, then, consider the Keynesian reaction. That probably came historically first in the way that I've set it up. The theory of what happens when markets don't clear was developed a bit later, when the European unemployment surfaced and persisted, resisting Keynesian prescriptions. Economists such as Dress, and now in India when you say Dress, you have to be very careful which Dress you are talking about. You're talking about Dress, I'm talking about Dress Senior. All right? Eunice, Benassi, Malenvaux, and Frank Hahn came up with their notion of equilibrium with unemployment, but Keynes, of course, had a go at it first. When markets did not clear, the short side of the market determines what happens, what transactions get carried out. Now, the reason why there was massive unemployment was because there was a problem with demand. Firms were not producing more, because they could not sell more. So they were selling just exactly as much as they could. They were producing exactly as much as they could sell, and so therefore there was unemployment. So you put some money into the pockets of people, you can get rid of it. Now, again, a Joan Robinson small story. You see, when one teaches macroeconomics, you come up with this S equals I, savings equal to identity. And I can hear Joan Robinson say, you got to read it from right to left. The first time I heard, I said, it's an equation. How does it matter whether you read it from right to left or left to right? But it did matter. Why? Because investment was the demand part of it, and that was constraining activities, and that was defining what was the amount of savings. So, but I've never seen any explanation in the terms that I have just given in any of these books. And it's always a bit of a mystery to me, why has it to be, and why does investment govern savings? You dare not ask her, because I thought I'd get my head bitten off if I asked her why it governed. All right, but this is the reason why it was. Now, we must also mention there was a completely different reason for unemployment, apart from the demand problem. And that is, again, due to a couple of people, Christopher Pissarides and Jan Mortensen, who got the Nobel in 2010, which involved wage bargaining and job search, but I just mention it because we are talking about unemployment. Now, moving on to the next departure from classical traditions, we begin by noting that in classical environments, information played no role. So everyone knew everything, or what is the current language, everything was common knowledge. I think it was Hayek who saw the markets as information processing systems and talked about incomplete information and asymmetric information in his book on individualism and economic order in 1948, and a more thorough investigation into what may happen took place in the 70s. In fact, the other, what happens when markets don't clear, that entire Dress, Malenvaux kind literature, that was also in the 70s. The work of Akerlof, Stiglitz, and Spence, recognized through a Nobel Memorial Prize in 2001, indicated that markets were commonly not able to transmit information as well as they were thought to be doing. And there was, of course, the very well-known classic Lemon's problem. And the curious part about it is that both Akerlof and Stiglitz identified this as a problem when they were working in underdeveloped countries. Akerlof sitting in Delhi and Stiglitz sitting in Nairobi. So you see, I think they saw underdeveloped, or let's say incomplete markets in action, kind of. The third strand that I'm going to talk about is actually not a single strand, but it's interwoven, arose with the work of Chair. How much time do I have? I have some more time, right?
Yes.
How much time?
You have about another 7
Huh? That's not enough. We started late. The idea that decision makers may be in adversarial roles came to the forefront, and the work that I'm referring to is that of von Neumann in 1944 and John Nash in 1951. Consequently, the notion of strategic behavior was introduced. In other words, decision-making was to be done only by considering what competitors might do. Then there came the question of incentives, also figured. Why should people carry out particular tasks? And why should institutions function? And then you have the entire mechanism design theory coming up at the same time. Now, let's get to Marx. The two of the most renowned scholars, Keynes and Samuelson, I think Dipankar talked about Keynes yesterday, and Samuelson made various disparaging comments about Marxian economics. Keynes, in fact, referred to Capital as an obsolete textbook that is not only scientifically erroneous, but also has no applicability to the real world. Samuelson, however, was less dismissive. He called Marx a minor post-Ricardian, but then later on said that Ricardo is highly overrated. So it was not really very much. But however, the person that I follow is Morishima, Michio Morishima. I got to know him quite well, actually. In his Walras lecture before the Econometric Society, described Marx as an outstanding economist and goes on as follows. But it is also true that among the economists mentioned above, Marx is unique. In fact, some might agree with Lange, this contention that Marx's economics was weak in analyzing the effects on some economic variables of a change in one of them, and its merits lay in providing a socio-economic explanation of the economic evolution of the capitalist society. There may still be many economists who do not regard Marx as a mathematical economist, but I believe that he was against mathematical economics. So that's Morishima. But he goes on to argue that this is not the case. Marx was well aware of his mathematical limitations, tried to make up for them, and in a letter to Engels in January 1858 says, and this is Marx writing to Engels, I am, when working out economic principles, so annoyingly obstructed by miscalculations that in despair I have again set myself the task of getting through algebra quickly. Arithmetic ever remains foreign to me. By this detour through algebra, however, I quickly trained myself up again. So here's this man saying that, look, he needs to try. 5 years later, we learn again from Morishima that Marx was enthusiastically studying differential and integral calculus. Not only that, he had written to Engels saying that, hey, you better read all this. You'll find it useful for your own researches. So Marx was learning mathematics too, but unfortunately the results pertaining to non-negative matrices and their properties were unknown to him. So he says, in fact, Morishima says, and this is, I'm quoting Morishima, on the other hand, because of his lack of mathematical training, Marx could not neatly apply the then existing mathematics to economic problems. Even if he had been able to do so, as I have said above, he would not have liked to devote himself to such a job. He was too ambitious and too original. Instead of by formulating economic problems precisely, he discovered new mathematical problems within economics and these problems were subsequently rediscovered independently by mathematicians and developed into important subjects in mathematics. He is referring to a class of results which relate to the properties of non-negative matrices due to Perron and Frobenius, but actually can be shown to be following from a much more classical result called the theorem of the separating hyperplane. So now, again, you see, what Marx wanted was they find out how is it that the capitalist economy is able to reproduce and expand. All right, so that was his focus. Inquiring how this was possible, one might have expected an answer in terms of efficiency and productivity. Again, according to Morishima, now you have to remember that Professor Morishima's use of the English language was, as he said, 93% or something. So he writes that Marx gave a peculiar answer. So what was peculiar about it? Presumably, Morishima found the answer peculiar because Marx provided the reason for the ability of the capitalists to reproduce and expand to be the fact that capitalists exploit workers. Now, to arrive at this conclusion, the labor theory of value played a central role. Morishima identifies this ability with what we now call the Hawkins-Simon condition. In fact, Morishima further qualifies the word peculiar by stating that the answer was advanced, and said further that he was not referring to its political progressiveness, but to its mathematical modernness. So problem arose in demonstrating the argument in its full-blown generality, since claims which were essentially mathematical were being made without checking, and so on. So I'm running short of time, so it's well known, and I don't need to find out or talk about them. Number of strict assumptions. You see, what Marx did was to look at the amount of labor which goes into producing a commodity both directly and indirectly. Now, in the measurement there, again, there is a problem. It can work only under what we call a Leontief structure. If you have something more complicated with joint products and so on, you get into all kinds of complications. And therefore, you may get into serious problems with Marxist conclusions. But let us, for the purpose of this lecture, grant Marx all his conclusions. I don't want to get into that. That is not my point. The argument that capitalists extract their profit from the workers is something that will appeal to many. Clearly, the rising inequality could find a straightforward explanation in this version of the story. Further to the exploitation of the workers, the capitalist economy cannot last. So this is the contradictions to capitalism that also you find within Marxian economics, and it runs right through. Now, to add to the attraction of such a prediction, okay, so let me just quickly wind up. So given this, to dismiss the importance of Marxian economics, to say that it is not robust enough, that it is true only in certain special types of models, I think would be a mistake. For there are some points which need to be noted where Marx was discussing departures from the classical setup. The noting that wages were just not enough to reproduce itself, or were just enough to reproduce itself, or assuming that labor be paid subsistence wages, was way before its time. You see, at that point in time, everyone said that labor should be paid margin product. Well, here was this person saying that subsistence wages. It turns out that he was not only accurate, he was very modern. That is what we say when we look at any kind of wage bargain that takes place. You see, if you think of a wage bargain in what we call a principal-agent framework, there are a couple of things that you need to worry about. One is the participation constraint. The participation constraint is the constraint which allows the laborer to just work. And that means you give them subsistence wages, they'll work. If you don't give them subsistence wages, they go away. The other thing which made this thing work in Marx was the fact that there was this army of unemployed. So if you didn't work, you'd get thrown out, right? So that also put all right, so that's one point. The second aspect that we need to applaud Marx for, and that is to introduce the notion of power into the employer-employee relationship. You'd never find any talk of power in any relationship in classical tradition. Here's this guy talking about it. So, given that the classical traditions were all about the market, it was clear that Marx was describing a situation where the participants or the decision makers were not passively reacting to market prices. So, given that Marx considered the prices as being dictated by values, the ability to extract work by paying less than what they had contributed was, no matter how crude, an exercise in power. Another aspect of the power that was wielded by the employer laid in the following. This is what I talked about, the reserve army of the unemployed. There are two things which are fundamentally important in Marx's schema, and these contributed immensely to the appeal of Marx's economics to many who thought that these were probably the source of strength of the capitalists. The crucial problem was that a coherent story which held together all aspects under more general terms could not be constructed either by Marx or by his followers. While the academics rejected the Marxists, perhaps because of the facts noted above, why did Marxist economies falter and collapse? After all, the party which ran these economies prospered. However, they did so at the cost of the common people who were kept at subsistence wages, and while there was reported to be no reserve army of the unemployed, being out of favor of the party was much worse. The answer, I think, also lay in the rise of the importance of information flows within economies and across them, and in the neglect of the incentives of the agents involved. The removal of capitalists and replacing them by the state as the owner of the means of production created, first of all, an inaccurate set of incentives. The state was not really interested in profitability and was interested in maintaining itself in control. Further, because of information flows through radio and TV first, and then later through social media, created huge changes in what were considered subsistence wages, something that Marx was more or less had taken to be accepted and is given. The study of incentives, again, a 70s phenomena, did not figure in any of the planning literature of the 50s and even 60s. In fact, I have a friend who did a PhD in planning from MIT. When I asked him, he said that no one talked about incentives at MIT in the 60s. So that is really a damning thing about the planning literature. So again, it was the information flow which had to be curtailed because people were finding out about what was the true state, and therefore you have the prevalence of accusations of fake news, or the disillusionment of the people are bound to set in, and to curb such disillusionment, more repressive measures would have become necessary. Consequently, the system had to go. I'm winding up. We are living in interesting times. Although Marxist economies are disappearing, maybe for reasons mentioned above, it does not mean that capitalist economies are thriving. They are struggling too. That these so-called capitalist economies will struggle given the conditions we are faced with is entirely predictable in terms of what we may be calling Neoclassical Economics. Piketty, for example, in his 2018 working paper referred to earlier, offers a theory of why inequalities will persist. The developments in Neoclassical Economics, which I have talked about, and the others that I did not get a chance to mention, have all crystallized recently into the new economics textbook, The Economy by CORE. The curriculum Open Access Research in Economics, this team is led by Sam Bowles and his associates. Available freely on the net, so you can download and read it, anyone can. The text explains how poverty and inequality may be seen as emanating from inequality of opportunity of market access rather than a matter of luck, choice, or ability. Now, if Marx put us on this road, then I think we must give him credit for that. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Mukherji. We have time for a number of questions or comments. Can I see who? Can people put their hands up if they want to make, or put one hand up if you want to, if you have a question? Yes, gentleman over here.
Thank you very much. I really enjoyed your presentation. It gave me the feeling that not all economists are normal people. You mentioned subsistence wages, and you mentioned it rather positively. But I thought you might also have included in that Marx's notion of socially necessary labor. Socially necessary labor. And therefore subsistence wages is not a static phenomenon, it's a dynamic one. And for some reason this aspect is missed out in many of the discussions on Marx. And one other point, and that is as a general observation, that is people do talk about Marx and socialism, whereas Marx had written precious little about socialism. At the most there's some sketchy writings in the critique of the Gotha program. Otherwise, to blame Marx for what socialists have done is a bit of an overreach.
So this is Manish. Sir, just a clarification. So you said that it was Akerlof and Stiglitz who introduced information economics in 70s, the Lemons problem. So I just needed to clarify if Friedrich Hayek, he wrote a book, The Road to Serfdom in 1945. The same year he also published a very popular paper, The Use of Knowledge in Society. I think that paper too had elements of information economics in it. Just a clarification. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Professor Mukherji, for that amazing exposition. I have a question about the way you've traced the development in while we get an idea about what happened to Marx and Marxian economics, we also get an idea of the different dimensions that opened up in the neoclassical tradition in your lecture. So one of the things I thought which you mentioned as the mechanisms, as mechanisms, but didn't really elaborate, and so I would like to know whether you see any kind of correspondence between what has emerged as new institutional economics or new political economy and Marxist political economy. Is there correspondence, or are these at like in some kind of a divergence? Thank you.
I have one comment and one question. I have one comment and one question. Here. Okay. I have one. Okay. I have one comment and one question. My comment is that I don't think Marx was assuming that there was perfect knowledge or there was complete knowledge. This is just my comment. And my question is that since you have traced out what contributions neoclassical economics have made.
Slowly, I can't make out.
Okay, I'll go slowly. Okay. My comment was that I don't think Marx assumed complete knowledge. That's my comment. My question is, since you have traced out the development of neoclassical economics and how it has internally developed, I want to ask you a question about neoclassical economics. Is there a mathematical model where all agents set prices on their own? And you have a comparable model to what is there in Walra?
Okay. Just one.
Yes.
Just 2 or 3 phrases. You didn't name Baumol, and Baumol was a neoclassical and the most effective response to Samuelson, because he read Marx, and he read Marx in German. The second thing is that you never named money. Money was essential to Marx, but you named Keynes, and Keynes, writing the general theory, had to stress that the key contribution of Marx was the cycle of money capital. And something like that is not in neoclassical theory, as I read it.
Okay.
Let me go with the easiest question. I think Sharath over there. True, I never said that Marx was firmly within the classical fold. I think he was moving away from it. So I don't think, I agree that he did not assume complete knowledge, okay? He probably did not have he was trying to identify, I don't think it was important to him, at least from the little that I have read, about what information was available. He just was looking at one thing, and that is to explain how the capitalist system was reproducing itself. And the second part I did not get. In neoclassical economics, you said something which we'll talk about outside because there's small time, but I'll try to resolve what you said. Dipankar, it's true that subsistence wages, I used it as a catchphrase, all right? But also, you have to remember that when Marx was talking about this, he assumed that this subsistence wages was taken to be given. Everyone knew what it was. Everyone accepted what subsistence wages was, necessary for reproduction and so on. The problem is it didn't remain like that. And that's the reason why I didn't get chance to fully flesh it out, is because of the information flows. Because once you start observing what is happening in the neighboring countries or across the border, you tend to say that, well, why am I satisfied with only this? Why don't I get something more? So what he was assuming, that is where the unrest started happening. That is, if you permit me to use the principal agent framework, it's that constraint started to change. And once you start changing, then the extent to which the capitalist can extract also goes down, because part of it he'll have to surrender. Also the wage union movements, you know, the union movements, labor union movements, jacking up the wages. And Manish, about Akerlof, yes, there were lots of things. And you, sir, you mentioned something about money and Baumol. Baumol, yes, I should have mentioned Baumol. That was a slip. But money, of course, and there are many things that I did not mention. I had all of 40 minutes to get through, and I didn't get through everything. So yes, money is something that we ought to have talked about. But my task was to find out, as I said, if you recollect, there are two things that I said. Why is it that people are attracted to Marxian economics? See, I grew up in the 1960s in Calcutta. I don't know whether any of you are aware with the kind of thing that I had to see. Some of the brightest of my college friends got involved in various kinds of things. Why? Because they actually thought that they could change society. And that was the thing which attracted me. They said, why is it? I know these guys are so good. How is it that they are? I have watched some of them, I have kept in touch with them, and I have observed how at the end of it all, they have turned. They have realized what has happened. I can't even begin to describe the kind of things that I have seen when I was a student in the college. So, I think it's that. And you know, Chirasri, certainly institutions. Institutions changing and how it changed, and how they changed and how they have continued to change and being moderated as you go along is what has destroyed not only Marxist economics or economies which followed Marxist principles, but also capitalist economies. I mean, if you look at, here my idea of what happened elsewhere was not very good, but even if you look at in India, for instance, in the 70s, things were cleaner in some sense. Well, atmospherically speaking and otherwise also. But now things have become a lot more murky. So you don't know what on earth is happening. So the institutions have changed, but this can be absolutely be predicted in terms of what I have been saying. I think anyone else? No, I think I've covered everyone. So I'll talk to you and tell you about money and other things later. But
Okay, on this note of leaving for later discussion the really complex issues, I want to thank Professor Anjan Mukherji for a very interesting lecture, for talking us through some of those complexities and, of course, prepare you for the next session. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Mukherji and Professor Toporowski. I request Dr. Sunita Lal to present our speaker and chair with the memento.